Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The smell hit Sheriff Maria Vasquez the moment she stepped out of her patrol car at the Ramirez Ranch. Not the usual mixture of cattle and sagebrush that defined West Texas, but something else entirely. Something that made her hand instinctively move to her service weapon even though she was responding to what should have been a routine livestock complaint. The stench was organic but wrong somehow. Not the clean decay of natural death in the desert, but something processed, industrial, tainted with chemicals that had no business existing in the vast emptiness of Presidio County. It was August 2019, and the drought had been merciless. Temperatures had soared past 115 degrees for weeks, baking the earth until it cracked like broken pottery. Ranchers across the county were losing cattle daily, their carcasses scattered across the desert like grim monuments to nature's indifference. But Eduardo Ramirez's call had been different. His voice had carried a tremor that spoke of more than mere concern about livestock losses. "Sheriff," he'd said during the 4 a.m. phone call that had pulled Vasquez from her first decent sleep in weeks, "you need to see what's happening to my herd. This ain't natural. This ain't even close to natural. I've been ranching this land for 37 years, and I've never seen anything like what I found this morning." The Ramirez spread stretched across 15,000 acres of some of the most unforgiving terrain in Texas, bordered by the Rio Grande to the south and endless desert to the north. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear without a trace, where the nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and where the only law was what you carried on your hip. Eduardo's grandfather had claimed this land in 1923, back when it was still possible to carve a life from the desert through sheer stubborn determination. 3 generations of Ramirez men had worked this soil, raised cattle on this grass, and buried their dead in the small family cemetery that overlooked the river valley. Eduardo met Sheriff Vasquez at the main gate, his weathered face pale beneath his sweat-stained hat brim. A third-generation rancher who had weathered everything from drought to drug cartels crossing his land on their way north, he looked shaken in a way that immediately put Vasquez on high alert. In all her years of knowing the man, she'd never seen him rattled. Eduardo Ramirez was the kind of Texan who faced problems head-on, whether they came in the form of cattle rustlers, flash floods, or border violence that occasionally spilled over from Mexico. "Started finding them about 2 weeks ago," he explained, as they drove deeper into the ranch in his dust-covered pickup, the air conditioning running full blast against the oppressive heat. "At first, I figured it was coyotes, maybe a mountain lion. We've had more predator activity since the drought started. They're coming closer to the river, following what's left of the wildlife. But coyotes don't do this. Hell, nothing in nature does this." The dirt road wound through mesquite and prickly pear cactus, past ancient windmills that squeaked protest against the desert wind. Eduardo pointed out various landmarks as they drove. The old line shack where his father used to shelter during roundups, the water tank that had been their salvation during the drought of '84, the fence line that marked the boundary with the abandoned Martinez Ranch. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should in this harsh but familiar landscape. The first carcass lay in a shallow arroyo about 3 miles from the main house, sheltered from casual view by a stand of salt cedar trees. What remained of the Angus steer was arranged in a pattern that defied natural scavenging. The bones had been meticulously cleaned and positioned in concentric circles around the skull, which sat upright in the center like a grotesque altar. Every scrap of flesh had been removed with surgical precision, leaving bones that gleamed white under the merciless sun. "Jesus," Sheriff Vasquez whispered, circling the arrangement while pulling out her camera. In her 15 years of law enforcement, she'd seen her share of bizarre crime scenes, but nothing like this. The precision was unsettling, almost artistic in its execution. Each bone had been placed with deliberate care, creating a mandala of death that spoke of patience, planning, and a deeply disturbed mind. "How many others?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. 17 so far, Eduardo replied, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead. "All exactly the same. Perfect circles, bones cleaned like they went through a professional processing plant. I found them scattered across about 1,000 acres, always in places like this, hidden from the main roads, but not so far out that they'd never be discovered." As they drove to examine more sites, Eduardo explained that he'd initially lost nearly 50 head of cattle to the drought and heat. Standard losses for such a harsh summer. Cattle seeking water in dangerous places, getting trapped in arroyos, or simply succumbing to the relentless heat. He'd found those carcasses too, scattered and torn by scavengers, bones bleached by sun and scattered by wind. Natural death in an unnatural season. But then the strange discoveries began. Cattle that had been systematically butchered and arranged in these ritualistic patterns, always in remote areas of the ranch, always in the same circular formation. The contrast between natural death and these careful arrangements was stark and deeply unsettling. "What's got me spooked," Eduardo continued as they bounced along the ranch road, "is that I never found any of the meat. 17 cattle, that's thousands of pounds of beef. Where'd it all go? And who's got the skill to strip bones this clean without leaving so much as a scrap behind?" Sheriff Vasquez documented each site with her camera, noting the consistent patterns while trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that pressed against her chest like a physical weight. The bones were always arranged in 3 concentric circles. The smallest bones on the outside, graduating to larger bones in the middle ring, with the skull positioned in the exact center. The precision was mathematical, each circle maintaining perfect proportions that suggested careful measurement and planning. More disturbing was the complete absence of tracks or tire marks near any of the sites. The West Texas soil, baked hard by the drought, should have shown some evidence of how these massive carcasses had been transported and arranged. Cattle didn't weigh hundreds of pounds when reduced to bone, but they started that way. Someone had to have brought them here, processed them, and arranged the remains. Yet the ground around each bone circle was undisturbed, as if the arrangements had materialized from thin air. The investigation took on new urgency when Eduardo's neighbor, cattle rancher Tom Whitman, called in his own complaint 3 days later. 5 of his prize Brahman bulls had been found arranged in identical bone circles on his property, which bordered the Ramirez spread. Like Eduardo's cattle, they'd been stripped of every ounce of flesh with surgical precision. Tom Whitman was cut from the same cloth as Eduardo, a lifetime rancher who'd seen just about everything the desert could throw at a man. But when Sheriff Vasquez met him at his ranch house, she found him pacing his front porch with a shotgun cradled in his arms, and his wife peering nervously from behind curtained windows. "Been ranching this land 42 years, Tom said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger and fear. "Seen rustlers, predators, disease, drought, flood. Hell, I've seen just about every way a cow can die. But this ain't about dying. This is about something sick, something that don't belong in civilized country." Tom's ranch covered 8,000 acres of slightly more hospitable land closer to the river, where underground springs provided water for his cattle even during the worst droughts. His operation was smaller than Eduardo's but more intensive. focusing on breeding stock that commanded premium prices across Texas and beyond. The loss of 5 prime bulls represented not just thousands of dollars in immediate value, but the disruption of breeding programs that had taken years to develop. These weren't just any cattle, Tom explained as they examined the bone circles on his land. These were my best breeding bulls, animals worth more than most people's cars. Someone knew exactly which animals to take, which suggests they've been watching my operation for months, maybe years. The bone arrangements on Tom's property showed the same meticulous precision as those found on the Ramirez Ranch, but with subtle variations that suggested the perpetrator was refining his technique. The circles were slightly larger, the bone placement more elaborate, and the central skull positioning included additional elements. Smaller bones arranged in patterns within the main circles, creating complex geometric designs that spoke of increasing sophistication and confidence. "This is organized," Sheriff Vasquez told her deputy, Carlos Mendoza, as they examined the newest crime scene. "Someone with serious anatomical knowledge is doing this, and they're doing it on a scale that suggests either multiple people or someone with access to serious equipment." Deputy Mendoza had been with the department for 12 years, working his way up from patrol officer to Vasquez's most trusted investigator. A former Marine with 2 tours in Afghanistan, he wasn't easily unsettled, but the bone circles clearly disturbed him in ways that conventional crimes never had. "The precision bothers me most," he admitted, photographing the arrangements from multiple angles. "This isn't random violence or even calculated cruelty. This is artistry, if you can call it that. Someone's taking pride in this work, treating it like a craft to be perfected." The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist from UT Austin who occasionally consulted for rural Texas law enforcement, arrived to examine the bone arrangements after Vasquez reached out through state channels. Dr. Chen had worked on cases involving ritual killings, cult activities, and mass graves, bringing expertise that rural departments rarely accessed. What she discovered would fundamentally change the nature of the investigation. "These bones weren't stripped by animals," Dr. Chen explained, pointing to microscopic scratches on a femur under her magnifying equipment. "They were processed with industrial equipment. Look at these cut marks. They're consistent with bandsaws and meat processing machinery. Someone's been running these cattle through a commercial butchering operation." But that revelation only deepened the mystery. The nearest meat processing facility was over 200 miles away in San Antonio, and none of the local butchers had reported any unusual activity or customers. Where was someone operating industrial meat processing equipment in one of the most remote areas of Texas? And why go to such elaborate lengths to arrange the bones in these ritualistic patterns instead of simply disposing of them? Dr. Chen spent 3 days examining all 22 bone circles that had been discovered across the 2 ranches. Her analysis revealed disturbing details about the perpetrator's methods and psychology. The cuts on the bones showed increasing skill and efficiency over time, suggesting someone who was learning and perfecting butchering techniques. The bone arrangements also showed evolution, becoming more complex and elaborate with each discovery. "We're looking at someone who views this as both a practical operation and an artistic endeavor," Dr. Chen explained during a briefing with Vasquez and her deputies. "The meat processing serves a commercial purpose. Someone's selling this beef, probably at premium prices to buyers who don't ask questions about its source. But the bone arrangements serve a different purpose entirely. They're signatures, calling cards that allow the perpetrator to take credit for his work while displaying his skills." The implications were chilling. If someone was selling rustled beef through commercial channels, they had access to buyers, transportation networks, and processing facilities that suggested a sophisticated criminal operation. but the ritualistic elements indicated psychological motivations that went beyond simple profit. The answer came during a routine flyover of the county by the Border Patrol, whose helicopter pilot reported seeing what appeared to be a large structure, partially buried in a canyon system about 10 miles from the Ramirez Ranch. The pilot, accustomed to spotting hidden drug labs and smuggling operations, noted that the structure showed signs of recent activity despite being invisible from ground level. When Sheriff Vasquez and her team investigated, they discovered something that explained the mysterious bone circles but raised far more disturbing questions about the scope and nature of the operation they were dealing with. Hidden in a natural canyon that cut deep into the desert floor, completely invisible from ground level and protected from aerial observation by camouflage netting, was a sophisticated meat processing operation that rivaled anything found in major cities. Solar panels provided power to refrigeration units, band saws, and industrial-grade butchering equipment. The facility could process several cattle simultaneously, with conveyor systems and specialized tools that would strip a carcass to bone in under an hour. But this wasn't a simple cattle rustling operation, and the evidence scattered throughout the facility made that horrifyingly clear. Posted throughout the butchering area were detailed anatomical charts, not of cattle, but of humans. Tables held surgical instruments alongside butchering tools. Most chilling was a hand-drawn map of the county, with dozens of locations marked, including not just ranches but also migrant worker camps, homeless encampments, and isolated residences where people lived alone and might not be missed if they disappeared. This wasn't about stealing cattle, Sheriff Vasquez realized with growing horror as she examined the human anatomical charts. The cattle were practice. Computer equipment found in a makeshift office area revealed the true scope of the operation. Email correspondences detailed a network of buyers for specialized meat products, with prices that far exceeded anything the legitimate beef market could support. Orders specified not just cuts and quantities, but ages, diets, and other characteristics that had nothing to do with conventional meat sales. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal agents arrived to process the scene. What they discovered was a sophisticated operation that had been preparing to transition from cattle to human victims. The bone circles weren't just disposal methods, they were signatures, calling cards left by someone who took artistic pride in their butchering skills and wanted the world to know about their expertise. DNA evidence from the processing equipment led to Marcus Crenshaw, a 43-year-old former Army medic turned veterinarian who had lost his license 2 years earlier following allegations of animal cruelty that now seemed like mere prelude to far worse crimes. Military records showed that Crenshaw had served 2 tours in Iraq, where he'd gained experience in field surgery and trauma treatment that had been perverted into something monstrous. Crenshaw had been using his medical knowledge and legitimate access to rural properties through his former veterinary practice to perfect his butchering techniques on livestock while building a clientele for more exotic products. His military training had taught him logistics, planning, and the kind of systematic approach that made his operation so difficult to detect. When Sheriff Vasquez and federal agents raided Crenshaw's registered address, a small ranch house 20 miles from the hidden facility, they found him calmly preparing for what he called his transition to premium products. Maps of local schools, detailed surveillance photos of families, and a prioritized list of potential victims were spread across his kitchen table like a grotesque business plan. "You found my workshop," Crenshaw said without emotion when confronted with evidence of his operation. "I was wondering when someone would finally appreciate the artistry. Those bone arrangements took hours to perfect. Each one was a masterpiece, a demonstration of skill and precision that most people couldn't even begin to understand." His clinical detachment was perhaps more disturbing than rage or panic would have been. Crenshaw spoke about his victims, both cattle and planned human targets, with the dispassionate professionalism of a surgeon discussing medical procedures. There was no remorse, no recognition that he had done anything wrong. Only pride in his technical expertise and frustration that law enforcement had interrupted his work. During interrogation, Crenshaw revealed the chilling logic behind his progression from cattle to humans. His buyers, reached through encrypted networks on the dark web, were willing to pay extraordinary sums for human meat from specific demographics. Young, healthy, organic-fed humans commanded the highest prices from customers whose appetites ran to the truly exotic. Cattle was just the beginning, he explained with clinical detachment, as if discussing a business expansion plan. My clients have very specific tastes, very particular requirements. The arrangements were my signature, proof of quality workmanship. Each circle represented a promise of what was to come, a demonstration that I could provide not just the product they wanted, but the artistry they appreciated. The federal investigation ultimately uncovered a nationwide network of similar operations, with Crenshaw's Texas facility serving as a model for other would-be suppliers. His meticulous documentation led to arrests in 6 other states, disrupting what the FBI described as one of the most sophisticated cannibalistic networks ever discovered in the United States. The psychological profiles developed by federal investigators painted a picture of a man whose military trauma had combined with pre-existing personality disorders to create something uniquely dangerous. Crenshaw's service in Iraq had exposed him to extreme violence and death, but instead of developing PTSD like many veterans, he had developed an appreciation for the aesthetic aspects of death and dismemberment. He learned to see beauty in destruction, explained FBI profiler Dr. Amanda Morrison, who interviewed Crenshaw extensively. His military medical training gave him the skills to preserve life, but his psychological makeup led him to find more satisfaction in ending it artistically. The bone circles represented his attempt to create something lasting and beautiful from death. For the residents of Presidio County, the revelation that such horror had been hiding in their midst was devastating. The vast, empty landscapes they'd always seen as symbols of freedom and independence suddenly seemed full of hidden dangers. Ranch families installed security systems and traveled in groups. Property values plummeted as people fled to more populated areas where anonymity was harder to achieve and crimes more difficult to conceal. Eduardo Ramirez sold his ranch within a year, unable to look at his land without seeing those bone circles scattered across terrain his family had worked for 3 generations. Every time I rode out to check cattle, he told Sheriff Vasquez during their final conversation, I wondered if I was looking at future victims or future crime scenes. The land felt contaminated, like something evil had seeped into the soil itself. Tom Whitman held on to his ranch but scaled back his operation significantly, focusing on smaller herds that he could monitor more closely. He installed motion sensors throughout his property and hired additional hands to ensure that his cattle were never left unattended. The costs of the security measures ate into his profits, but he couldn't bear the thought of losing more animals to Crenshaw's twisted artistry. Sheriff Vasquez continued serving Presidio County, but the case left her profoundly changed. She established new protocols for investigating livestock crimes, recognizing that in remote rural areas, seemingly simple complaints could mask sophisticated criminal operations. Her department partnered with federal agencies to monitor for signs of industrial equipment in remote locations and developed relationships with Border Patrol to increase aerial surveillance of the county's vast expanses. The psychological impact on the community proved lasting and pervasive. Local support groups formed to help residents process the trauma of learning they'd been living so close to such calculated evil. Children had nightmares about bone circles appearing in their yards. Adults found themselves unable to enjoy the solitude that had drawn them to West Texas in the first place, constantly wondering what other horrors might be hidden in the endless desert that surrounded them. The scariest thing about Crenshaw, Sheriff Vasquez later explained to a gathering of rural law enforcement officers, wasn't his methods or his equipment. It was his patience. He spent years perfecting his techniques, building his client base, studying potential victims. He turned our isolation against us, using the very remoteness we loved to hide his preparations for something unthinkably evil. The psychological warfare aspect of Crenshaw's crimes became clearer as investigators analyzed his methods more thoroughly. The bone circles weren't just artistic expressions or disposal methods. They were deliberate attempts to terrorize the community, to make residents feel unsafe in their own environment. By targeting cattle first, Crenshaw had established his presence and capabilities while building toward human victims. The arrangement served as calling cards, warnings of what was to come. The Hidden Canyon facility was eventually destroyed by controlled explosion, but its location remains marked on county maps as a reminder of how thoroughly evil can embed itself in even the most seemingly innocent landscapes. Local ranchers still occasionally report finding unusual bone arrangements, though investigations have never revealed evidence of renewed criminal activity. The paranoia lingers, a permanent scar on the community's psyche. Dr. Chen's forensic analysis of Crenshaw's bone circles became a case study taught in criminal justice programs across the country. Her report noted that the arrangements showed increasing sophistication over time, suggesting that Crenshaw was not just practicing his butchering skills, but developing an artistic signature for his future human victims. Each circle was a promise, Dr. Chen wrote in her final report. Crenshaw was essentially leaving calling cards, announcing his presence and capabilities to anyone with the knowledge to recognize them. In his mind, he was building a reputation for quality and precision that would eventually translate to higher prices in his human trafficking operation. The case files revealed that Crenshaw had been in contact with potential buyers for human meat for over 2 years before his arrest, carefully building relationships and establishing credibility through his cattle work. The transition to human victims had been planned meticulously, with specific targets already selected and surveillance completed. Law enforcement had interrupted the operation just weeks before Crenshaw planned to claim his first human victim. Today, Presidio County remains one of Texas's most sparsely populated regions, its vast landscapes still drawing those seeking solitude and independence. But local residents maintain a vigilance that didn't exist before the Crenshaw case. Strange smells, unusual arrangements of objects, any sign of industrial activity in remote areas triggers immediate reports to law enforcement. The bone circles may be gone, but their psychological impact lingers in ways both subtle and profound. In a landscape where cattle skulls have always been common sights, bleached white by the desert sun, residents now look twice at every arrangement of bones, wondering if nature or something far more sinister was responsible for their placement. Children growing up in Presidio County learn different lessons than their parents did. They're taught to report any unusual sights or smells, to travel in groups even on family land, and to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. The innocence of rural childhood, where children could disappear for hours exploring the desert and return safely at dinner time, has been permanently altered by the knowledge of what evil can hide in empty places. Sheriff Vasquez retired in 2023, but she still receives calls from colleagues across Texas asking her to consult on cases involving unusual livestock crimes. The Crenshaw case changed how rural law enforcement approaches seemingly routine complaints, recognizing that sophisticated criminal operations can hide behind facades of normalcy. You learn to see patterns differently after something like the Crenshaw case, she explained during her retirement interview. What looks random might be carefully planned. What seems like natural death might be calculated murder. In rural law enforcement, you can never assume that isolated crimes are actually isolated. Sometimes they're just the visible parts of something much larger and more dangerous. The case files on Marcus Crenshaw fill 3 large boxes in the Presidio County Sheriff's Department evidence room, a testament to the complexity of the investigation and the thoroughness required to unravel his network. Among them are hundreds of photographs of bone circles, each one a testament to his twisted artistry, and a reminder that in the vast emptiness of West Texas, predators can hide in plain sight, perfecting their craft until they're ready to reveal their true intentions. For the families who remained in Presidio County after the case concluded, the landscape gradually reclaimed its beauty. Sunsets still paint the desert in brilliant colors. Cattle still graze across endless horizons, and the silence of the wilderness still offers profound peace. But that peace now comes with the hard-earned knowledge that evil can flourish anywhere, given enough time, space, and the kind of isolation that allows it to grow unchecked. The memorial erected at the county courthouse includes the names of the 17 cattle that were Crenshaw's known victims, along with a plaque acknowledging the human victims who were saved by the investigation's timely conclusion. It serves as a reminder that in rural America, the protection of livestock and the protection of human life are often more closely connected than urban dwellers might realize. The bone circles are gone, but their legacy remains in the heightened awareness of a community that learned too late that their greatest strength, their isolation, could also be their greatest vulnerability in the hands of someone patient enough to exploit it. The desert keeps its secrets, but the people of Presidio County now know that some secrets are too dangerous to remain hidden, and some silences too deadly to remain unbroken. Deputy Sheriff Jack Morrison had driven State Highway 118 through Brewster County thousands of times in his 8 years of service, but on that scorching afternoon in July 2020, something was fundamentally different about the familiar route. Something was wrong in a way that made his skin crawl despite the 110-degree heat that shimmered off the asphalt like liquid mercury, distorting the desert landscape into wavering mirages that seemed to mock his growing sense of unease. The call had come in at 2:47 p.m. from a frantic tourist whose GPS had led him in circles for 3 hours while searching for the entrance to Big Bend National Park. The man's voice had escalated from confusion to panic as he described his impossible situation over a cell phone connection that kept cutting in and out. "I keep passing the same landmarks," the man had insisted, his voice tight with the kind of fear that comes from being lost in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. "The road signs say I'm going the right direction, but I end up back where I started every time. It's like there's a piece of the highway that just disappears. Officer, I've been driving for 30 years, and this doesn't make any sense. The sun says I'm going east, but my compass says north, and the GPS just shows blank space." Sheriff Morrison might have dismissed it as heat exhaustion or a simple navigation error. Tourist complaints weren't uncommon in Brewster County, where the combination of extreme heat, desolate terrain, and spotty cell coverage created challenges for even experienced travelers. But this call was the 4th similar report that had come in over the past week, each describing the same impossible experience. Following a straight highway that somehow led them in circles, passing identical rock formations and fence posts multiple times, despite never turning around. Highway 118 was one of the loneliest roads in Texas, cutting through 80 miles of desert wilderness between Alpine and the entrance to Big Bend National Park. It was the kind of road where a breakdown could mean death, where experienced travelers carried extra water, emergency beacons, and satellite phones as a matter of survival. The landscape was beautiful in its harshness. Vast expanses of Chihuahuan desert stretching to distant mountains, dotted with prickly pear cactus, ocotillo, and the occasional stunted mesquite tree clinging to life in the arid soil. Morrison had grown up in this country, learned to drive on roads like Highway 118, and could navigate by landmarks that were invisible to outsiders. He knew every cattle guard, every mile marker, every distinctive rock formation along the route, which was why what he discovered during his investigation would shake his understanding of reality itself. Morrison decided to drive the route himself, paying careful attention to landmarks and mile markers that had been as familiar to him as the rooms of his own house. For the first 40 miles out of Alpine, everything appeared normal. The familiar sequence of cattle guards marking ranch boundaries, the distinctive red sandstone formation known locally as Cathedral Rock, the weathered billboard advertising a long-closed trading post that had become a landmark in its own right. But as he approached what should have been mile marker 73, something felt profoundly wrong. The landmark he expected, a distinctive red sandstone formation locals called the Devil's Thumb, a towering spire that had guided travelers for over a century, was missing. In its place stood terrain he didn't recognize, a series of low hills covered in vegetation that shouldn't exist in this part of the desert. The hills were covered with desert willow and salt cedar, plants that required more water than this area typically received. More disturbing, his odometer showed he'd traveled the correct distance from Alpine, but the mile markers seemed to skip from 72 directly to 75, as if mile marker 74 had been erased from existence. Morrison pulled over and checked his GPS, which showed his location as a blank area with no roads marked. His radio crackled with static instead of the clear communication he normally maintained with dispatch. According to every piece of technology in his patrol car, he was in the middle of empty desert, despite being on a major state highway. Morrison continued driving, documenting everything with his dash camera while fighting off a growing sense of disorientation. What he recorded would later become crucial evidence in what federal investigators would classify as one of the most audacious fraud schemes ever attempted in rural America. A crime that literally reshaped the landscape to hide evidence of systematic looting on an unprecedented scale. Mile marker 74 was missing entirely, and the landscape on either side of the road had shifted subtly but noticeably. The familiar geology of the area, limestone outcroppings and volcanic rock formations that had been shaped by millions of years of erosion, had been replaced by terrain that seemed artificial. The rock formations were too regular, too symmetrical, lacking the random beauty that characterized natural desert sculpture. Even the plant life was wrong, too green, too lush, arranged in patterns that suggested irrigation systems hidden beneath the surface. Most unsettling, the highway itself seemed newer in this section. The asphalt lacked the weathering and crack repairs that characterized the rest of the route, and the yellow lines were painted with mathematical precision that contrasted sharply with the hand-painted irregularities typical of rural highway maintenance. It was as if this entire section of road had been constructed recently, but that was impossible. Highway 118 had been completed in 1963, and Morrison had driven this exact route hundreds of times over the past 8 years. When Morrison reached mile marker 75, the familiar landscape resumed as if nothing had happened. The Devil's Thumb appeared right where it should be, exactly as he remembered it from childhood trips to Big Bend with his grandfather. His GPS reacquired satellite signals, his radio cleared up, and the desert returned to its familiar, harsh beauty. But according to his dash camera's timestamp, he'd somehow traveled 3 miles in the time it should have taken to cover one. Back at the sheriff's department in Alpine, Morrison reviewed the footage with his supervisor, Sheriff Elena Cortez, a 30-year veteran of rural law enforcement who had seen everything from cattle rustling to drug smuggling to the occasional tourist death from dehydration or exposure. But what they saw on Morrison's dash camera defied logical explanation. A mile of highway that existed but shouldn't, featuring landscape that belonged nowhere in Brewster County. Someone's built a fake road, Sheriff Cortez concluded, after examining the footage frame by frame. Question is why and how they managed to do it without anyone noticing. You don't just reroute a state highway overnight. The investigation began with a review of State Highway Department records going back decades. According to official documentation, no construction or major repairs had been authorized for Highway 118 in over 5 years. The last significant work had been routine resurfacing in 2015, completed by a contractor from San Antonio, whose work had been inspected and approved by state engineers. Satellite imagery from Google Earth, updated as recently as 6 months earlier, showed the familiar desert landscape with no signs of the altered terrain Morrison had documented. But when deputies drove the route again the next day, the anomalous mile was still there, as solid and real as any other piece of Texas highway. The fake landscape showed no signs of being an illusion or temporary installation. The vegetation had established root systems, the rock formations showed weathering patterns, and the road surface bore the marks of regular traffic. Worse, they encountered 2 stranded motorists whose vehicles had broken down in the mysterious section. Both reported that their cars had been running perfectly until they entered what they described as the wrong part of the road, where their engines began overheating despite full coolant reservoirs, and their electrical systems started malfunctioning in ways their mechanics had never seen before. One of the stranded motorists was Dr. James Harrison, a geology professor from UT Austin who had been traveling to Big Bend to conduct research on desert rock formations. His breakdown had occurred directly in front of one of the artificial rock outcroppings, giving him an opportunity to examine it closely while waiting for help. "This isn't natural stone," Dr. Harrison told Morrison while they waited for a tow truck. "It's some kind of composite material designed to look like limestone, but the mineral composition is all wrong. The weathering patterns are artificial too. Someone's used chemicals to make new construction look like it's been here for centuries." Dr. Harrison's expertise proved invaluable to the investigation. As a geologist who specialized in the rock formations of West Texas, he could identify the specific characteristics that made the mysterious mile's landscape impossible. The rock structures showed none of the geological layering that resulted from millions of years of sedimentary deposition. Instead, they appeared to be constructed from molded materials designed to mimic natural stone. "Whoever did this has serious resources and expertise," Dr. Harrison explained. "Creating convincing fake rock formations requires knowledge of geology, chemistry, and construction techniques that go far beyond what most criminals possess. This is the work of professionals with access to specialized equipment and materials." The breakthrough came when Morrison noticed something during his 3rd trip through the altered section. Tire tracks leading off the highway into what appeared to be solid rock. The tracks were barely visible, camouflaged by the artificial weathering of the fake stone, but they definitely led somewhere. Following them on foot, he discovered that what looked like a natural cliff face was actually an expertly camouflaged entrance to a massive excavation site. Hidden behind the false rock facade was an operation that boggled the mind in its scope and ambition. The excavation covered several acres, hidden from aerial observation by camouflage netting that had been painted to match the surrounding desert. Dozens of workers were using industrial equipment to extract artifacts from carefully mapped archaeological sites, operating with the precision and efficiency of a major construction project. The workers scattered when they spotted Morrison, but the evidence of their operation was undeniable. This wasn't a simple treasure-hunting expedition or amateur artifact collecting. This was systematic archaeological looting on an industrial scale, with proper excavation techniques, documentation systems, and preservation methods that rivaled those used by legitimate research institutions. Sheriff Cortez called in federal backup, and within hours, FBI and DEA agents were surrounding the site with the assumption that they were dealing with a drug operation or weapons smuggling network. What they discovered was neither, but something far more audacious. A massive antiquities smuggling network that had been systematically looting Native American archaeological sites across West Texas for over 3 years. The operation, led by Dr. Richard Hawthorne, a former archaeology professor who had lost his tenure at the University of New Mexico due to ethical violations involving artifact sales, had been using sophisticated ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery to identify burial sites and artifact caches throughout the region. The fake highway allowed his team to work undetected while maintaining the appearance of normal traffic flow for any law enforcement patrols. Dr. Hawthorne had been a respected archaeologist for over 20 years before his fall from grace. His expertise in southwestern Native American cultures had made him a sought-after consultant for museums and private collectors. But his academic career had ended when it was discovered that he had been selling artifacts from legitimate dig sites to private buyers. The University of New Mexico had quietly forced his resignation to avoid scandal, but that had only freed him to pursue far more lucrative and destructive activities. They weren't just stealing artifacts, FBI agent Sarah Martinez explained to Sheriff Cortez as they toured the underground facility that had been carved into the desert floor beneath the fake landscape. They were erasing entire archaeological sites from existence. Some of these burial grounds date back over 1,000 years, representing irreplaceable records of human habitation in this region. The excavation revealed the remains of what had been one of the most significant Native American settlements in the region, now reduced to empty holes and disturbed earth. Hawthorne's team had been systematically removing everything of value: pottery, tools, jewelry, human remains, and artifacts that could be sold to private collectors willing to pay enormous sums for authentic antiquities with no questions asked about their provenance. The scope of the destruction was staggering. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed the extent of the original settlement, a complex community that had existed for centuries before European contact, with elaborate burial sites, ceremonial areas, and evidence of sophisticated agricultural systems. All of it had been reduced to empty holes in the ground, the cultural heritage of an entire people strip-mined for profit. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In Hawthorne's private office, a climate-controlled trailer hidden beneath the camouflage netting, investigators found detailed files on over 50 other potential sites across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The fake highway was just the beginning of a planned expansion that would have created a network of rerouted roads and hidden excavations across the Southwest. Each file contained satellite imagery, geological surveys, and historical research identifying locations where Native American settlements had existed. Hawthorne had been using his academic credentials and research connections to access databases of archaeological sites, essentially creating a treasure map for systematic looting. The files showed that he had already begun preliminary work at 6 other locations, using the same techniques that had proven so successful in Brewster County. When federal agents arrested Hawthorne at a luxury hotel in Austin, where he had been meeting with potential buyers from Europe and Asia, he showed no remorse for his actions. Instead, he maintained the arrogant academic superiority that had characterized his legitimate career, lecturing his captors about the importance of his work. "You have no idea what we were preserving," he told investigators during his initial interrogation. "These artifacts would have been destroyed by development or lost to amateur treasure hunters who don't understand their historical significance. We were saving history, documenting everything, ensuring that these cultural treasures would be preserved for future generations. The legal argument fell apart when investigators discovered that Hawthorne had been selling the stolen artifacts to private collectors and foreign museums, with some pieces bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars. Rather than preserving history, he had been trafficking it to the highest bidders, often providing false documentation that claimed the artifacts had been legally obtained from private collections. Financial records revealed that Hawthorne's operation had generated over $12 million in sales over 3 years, with buyers ranging from wealthy private collectors to foreign museums seeking to enhance their Native American collections without concerning themselves with legal acquisition methods. The network included middlemen in major cities, authentication services that created false provenance documents, and shipping companies that specialized in moving valuable items without excessive documentation. The fake mile of highway posed unique challenges for cleanup crews. The altered landscape had been so expertly constructed that simply removing it would have left a dangerous gap in the roadway, potentially causing accidents as drivers suddenly encountered terrain that didn't match their expectations or GPS systems. Instead, engineers had to carefully deconstruct the artificial terrain while building a new section of highway that properly connected the existing route. The process took 8 months and cost taxpayers over $2 million, an expense that generated considerable controversy in Austin, as legislators questioned how such an elaborate fraud could have gone undetected for so long. Highway Department officials were forced to implement new inspection protocols and satellite monitoring systems to prevent similar incidents in the future. During construction, traffic was rerouted through a genuine detour that added 30 miles to the journey between Alpine and Big Bend, serving as a constant reminder to local residents of how thoroughly the criminals had manipulated their landscape. The detour passed through some of the most desolate country in Texas, where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 115 degrees, and mechanical failures could be fatal without proper preparation. For the Native American tribes whose ancestors had been disturbed by Hawthorne's operation, the discovery brought both closure and renewed trauma. The Mescalero Apache, whose ancestral lands included the desecrated sites, worked with federal officials to properly reinter human remains and conduct blessing ceremonies for the locations that had been violated. What they did goes beyond theft, explained Robert Whitehorse, a tribal elder who participated in the restoration ceremonies. They stole our ancestors' rest, our connection to the land, our history. The fake road was just the beginning of the violation. It was designed to hide the rape of our sacred places. The cultural impact extended beyond the immediate tribal communities. The archaeological sites that Hawthorne had destroyed contained information about human adaptation to desert environments, agricultural techniques, and social organization that could have contributed to understanding of how societies survive in harsh climates. Climate change researchers had been particularly interested in studying how ancient peoples had managed water resources during periods of extended drought. The case prompted a comprehensive review of archaeological site protection across federal lands. New satellite monitoring systems were implemented to detect unauthorized excavations, penalties for antiquities trafficking were significantly increased, and international cooperation agreements were strengthened to prevent the sale of looted artifacts in foreign markets. Sheriff Cortez established a new protocol for her department, requiring deputies to report any unusual landscape features or construction activity, no matter how minor it might seem. If someone can hide an entire excavation operation and reroute a state highway without us noticing, she told her staff during a training session, we need to pay much closer attention to what's happening in our county. The psychological impact on local law enforcement was profound and lasting. Deputies found themselves questioning their knowledge of familiar routes. double-checking landmarks they'd relied on for years, and maintaining detailed logs of their patrol observations. The idea that the landscape itself could be manipulated so thoroughly challenged their basic assumptions about navigation and territorial awareness. Morrison, who had first noticed the anomalous mile, continued patrolling Highway 118, but never quite trusted his instincts the same way again. He installed additional GPS units in his patrol car and began taking photographs of significant landmarks during each shift, creating a visual database that could detect future alterations. "You think you know every rock and curve on your patrol routes," he explained to new deputies during training sessions. "But this case taught me that even the ground beneath your feet might not be what it seems. In rural law enforcement, we depend on our knowledge of the terrain. But that knowledge is only as good as the assumption that the terrain isn't being artificially manipulated." The investigation ultimately led to the recovery of over 3,000 stolen artifacts, many of which were returned to appropriate tribal authorities for reburial or preservation. The identification of an international smuggling network with connections in Europe and Asia resulted in diplomatic efforts to repatriate artifacts that had already been sold to foreign buyers. Hawthorne received a 20-year federal sentence for conspiracy, theft of cultural artifacts, destruction of archaeological sites, and fraud. His crew members, many of whom had been hired as day laborers without knowledge of the operation's true scope, bargained for shorter terms in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing investigation. The sentencing hearing revealed additional details about Hawthorne's methods and motivations. Expert witnesses testified that his academic training had made him uniquely qualified to identify valuable sites and execute sophisticated looting operations. Unlike amateur treasure hunters who typically destroyed archaeological context in their haste to find valuable items, Hawthorne had maintained detailed records and proper excavation techniques that preserved some scientific value while maximizing profit. Dr. Hawthorne represents a particularly dangerous type of criminal, testified Dr. Maria Santos, an archaeology professor who had worked with federal investigators to assess the damage. His legitimate expertise allowed him to identify the most valuable and significant sites, while his academic credentials provided cover for his criminal activities. The destruction he caused will impact our understanding of southwestern cultures for generations. Today, Highway 118 runs straight and true through Brewster County, its route properly marked and monitored by both ground-based inspections and satellite surveillance. But locals still referred to the section between mile markers 73 and 75 as the missing mile, a reminder of how thoroughly their reality had been manipulated by criminals with the resources and audacity to literally move mountains. The restored section of highway includes additional emergency call boxes and enhanced cellular coverage, improvements that resulted from the investigation's revelation of how isolated travelers had become when their vehicles malfunctioned in the artificial terrain. The new infrastructure provides safety benefits that extend beyond the specific location where Hawthorne's operation had been concealed. The case became a legend among Texas law enforcement, a cautionary tale about the sophisticated lengths criminals will go to conceal their operations. Training scenarios now include discussions of how familiar landscapes can be altered to hide criminal activity, and deputies are taught to trust their instincts when something feels wrong about their environment, even if they can't immediately identify what has changed. For the thousands of tourists who drive Highway 118 each year on their way to Big Bend National Park, the restored section appears identical to the rest of the route. But careful observers might notice that the asphalt is slightly newer, the mile markers slightly brighter, and the landscape just a bit too carefully maintained compared to the natural randomness that characterizes most of the desert highway. Sheriff Cortez kept a piece of the fake rock facade in her office as a reminder of the case and its implications for rural law enforcement. "It looks completely real," she would tell visitors, hefting the lightweight synthetic material that had been crafted to perfectly mimic natural limestone. You could touch it, lean against it, even climb on it, and never know it wasn't genuine stone. That's the lesson of the missing mile. Sometimes the most dangerous deception is the one that seems perfectly ordinary. The archaeological sites disturbed by Hawthorne's operation were eventually restored and protected under federal law, but the knowledge of what had been lost continued to haunt the investigation. Experts estimated that the looting had destroyed evidence of human habitation spanning over 15 centuries, erasing irreplaceable information about how indigenous peoples had adapted to climate changes, developed agricultural techniques, and maintained complex societies in one of North America's most challenging environments. Years later, when Morrison retired from the sheriff's department and took a position with the National Park Service at Big Bend, he was asked what case had taught him the most about rural law enforcement. Without hesitation, he mentioned the missing mile. "It taught me never to trust that things are what they appear to be," he said during his retirement interview. "In rural patrol, you think you're dealing with simple crimes, cattle theft, drug runs, domestic disputes, but sometimes you stumble onto something so big and sophisticated that it changes how you see everything else." The missing mile wasn't just about stolen artifacts. It was about how criminals with enough resources and expertise can literally reshape reality to hide their crimes. The fake highway remains a case study in criminal engineering, analyzed by law enforcement agencies and security experts worldwide. Its construction required expertise in road building, landscape manipulation, camouflage technology, and logistics coordination that rivaled military operations. The level of planning and execution suggested criminal organizations with capabilities far beyond what most law enforcement agencies were prepared to encounter. But for the residents of Brewster County, the most unsettling legacy of the missing mile wasn't its sophistication but its invisibility. For months, hundreds of people had driven past a massive criminal operation without suspecting anything was wrong. The landscape they thought they knew had been systematically altered, and none of them had noticed until technology began failing and travelers started getting lost. The case file on the missing mile continues to grow as investigators discover new connections to other archaeological looting operations across the Southwest. Each new revelation serves as a reminder that in the vast emptiness of rural Texas, criminals with sufficient resources and determination can literally reshape reality to serve their purposes, hiding in plain sight until someone finally notices that the familiar road home leads somewhere it was never supposed to go. The memorial erected near the site includes information about the destroyed archaeological sites and the cultural heritage that was lost to Hawthorne's greed. It serves as both a tribute to the ancestral peoples whose remains were disturbed and a warning about the ongoing threats to archaeological sites throughout the American Southwest. For law enforcement agencies across rural America, the missing mile case has become a standard training example of how seemingly impossible crimes can be accomplished through careful planning, significant resources, and exploitation of the isolation that characterizes rural communities. It demonstrates that criminals are constantly evolving, developing new methods that challenge traditional assumptions about what is possible in terms of concealment and deception. The desert has reclaimed much of the evidence of Hawthorne's operation, but the lessons learned from the missing mile continue to influence how rural law enforcement approaches seemingly routine complaints and unusual observations. In a landscape where distance and isolation can work against both criminals and law enforcement, the ability to recognize when familiar terrain has been altered may be the difference between stopping a crime and allowing it to continue undetected for years. The cornfield stretched endlessly under the October sky, its golden stalks rustling in the hot Texas wind like 1,000 whispered secrets that seemed to carry promises too terrible to understand. Sheriff Danny Reeves had walked these roads before during routine patrol checks, but never with the growing sense of dread that now pressed against his chest like a physical weight, making each breath a conscious effort as he pushed deeper into the maze of corn that had become the epicenter of his county's worst nightmare. It had started with the children, as these things always seemed to in rural communities where childhood still carried echoes of simpler times. 3 weeks earlier, parents across Lampasas County began reporting the same disturbing behavior. Their kids would return from playing outdoors, claiming to have heard voices calling their names from empty fields, sweet feminine voices that promised games and treats and adventures if only they would come and play. At first, it seemed like typical childhood imagination, the kind of harmless fear that rural kids develop about dark woods and abandoned barns. Stories they tell each other to create excitement in lives that can sometimes feel too quiet and predictable. Parents dismissed the reports with gentle corrections about not wandering too far from home, not talking to strangers, and always telling grown-ups where they were going. But then, Lucy Morrison, age 7, disappeared from her backyard while her mother was hanging laundry just 20 feet away on a Tuesday afternoon that had started like any other in their comfortable ranch-style home on the outskirts of town. The Morrison family had lived in Lampasas County for 4 generations, farming the same land that Lucy's great-great-grandfather had claimed in 1887, raising cattle and corn and children who grew up knowing every tree and creek and hidden place for miles around. The mother, Janet Morrison, swore she had been watching Lucy play in the garden when the child suddenly stood up from where she'd been collecting smooth stones for a school project and walked purposefully toward the cornfield behind their house, as if responding to a summons only she could hear. Lucy's behavior had been completely out of character. She was normally a cautious child who stayed close to home and always asked permission before going anywhere, even to the mailbox at the end of their long driveway. "Lucy!" Janet had called, dropping a wet sheet back into the laundry basket and hurrying after her daughter. But Lucy didn't turn around or acknowledge her mother's voice. Instead, Lucy had pushed through the edge of the cornfield with the determination of someone who knew exactly where she was going, disappearing into the golden rows as if she were walking through a doorway rather than into a maze of 8-foot-tall corn stalks. By the time Janet reached the spot where her daughter had entered the field, there was no trace of the child, no bent stalks, no footprints in the soft earth that had been recently cultivated, no sound of movement in the maze of corn that stretched for 40 acres behind their house. It was as if Lucy had simply been absorbed by the field itself, vanishing as completely as morning dew under the Texas sun. The search had lasted 6 days and nights, becoming the largest volunteer effort in Lampasas County's history. Sheriff Reeves coordinated teams of volunteers that included local ranchers, volunteer firefighters, church groups, and concerned parents from 3 neighboring counties. They brought in tracking dogs from Austin, requested helicopter support from the state police, and even consulted with search and rescue experts who specialized in finding missing children in agricultural areas. They combed every acre of the Brewster Farm's corn maze, following grid patterns that should have revealed any trace of a 7-year-old girl. The corn was at full height, creating a labyrinth that could easily confuse even adults, but the searchers were methodical and thorough. They called Lucy's name until their voices were hoarse, listened for any sound of crying or movement, and examined every piece of debris that might indicate her passage through the field. But Lucy Morrison had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind no physical evidence and no logical explanation for how a 7-year-old child could disappear from a confined area that had been searched by dozens of experienced volunteers and trained professionals. The case took a disturbing turn when 2 more children disappeared under identical circumstances over the following week, transforming what might have been an isolated tragedy to a pattern that sent terror through every family in the county. Tommy Rodriguez, age 9, walked away from a family barbecue at his grandmother's house on a Sunday afternoon when 3 dozen relatives were gathered in the backyard to celebrate his cousin's birthday. Tommy had been playing with his siblings and cousins, running around the yard and enjoying the kind of chaotic family gathering that characterized Latino culture in Central Texas. But witnesses said he suddenly stopped playing, ignored his cousin's calls to join a game of tag, and walked directly toward the cornfield that bordered his grandmother's property. Tommy's father, Miguel Rodriguez, worked construction in Austin, but had grown up in Lampasas County and knew the dangers that rural areas could pose to children. He had taught Tommy about rattlesnakes, warned him about getting lost in cornfields, and established clear boundaries for where his son was allowed to play. Tommy was an obedient child who had never wandered off alone before, making his sudden departure even more inexplicable. It was like he was sleepwalking, Tommy's grandmother, Maria Rodriguez, told Sheriff Reeves during the investigation. His eyes were open, he was walking normal, but when we called his name it was like he couldn't hear us, like he was listening to something else, something more important than his family. Maria Santos, age 6, left her bedroom during her afternoon nap on a Wednesday and was found to have walked directly into the corn maze behind the local elementary school where she was a first-grade student. Her mother, Carmen Santos, had put her down for a nap after lunch, as was their daily routine during the summer break. Carmen had been working in her kitchen, which had a clear view of Maria's bedroom window, when she realized that she could no longer hear the small sounds that indicated her daughter was sleeping peacefully. When Carmen checked the bedroom, she found the window open and Maria nowhere to be found. Footprints in the soft soil of their garden led directly to the fence line that separated their property from the school grounds, and from there to the edge of the corn maze that the school used for their annual Halloween fundraiser. In each case, witnesses described the same eerie behavior. Children who suddenly stopped whatever they were doing and walked with apparent purpose toward the nearest cornfield, ignoring calls from parents and seemingly deaf to all attempts to stop them. The children showed no signs of distress or fear, no indication that they were being coerced or threatened. Instead, they appeared to be following instructions from someone they trusted completely. "It's like they're being called," Tommy's father, Miguel Rodriguez, told Sheriff Reeves during one of many interviews conducted as the investigation expanded. Like someone they trust is telling them to come. But the fields are empty. We've checked every inch, brought in dogs, used helicopters. There's nobody there, but the children keep walking toward the corn like they're going to meet a friend. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Wilson, a child psychologist brought in from Austin to counsel the families and help them cope with the trauma of their losses, noticed a pattern in the testimony that law enforcement had missed. Each disappearance had occurred during the afternoon hours when the sun created long shadows through the corn rows, and each child had been playing alone in a backyard that bordered farmland immediately before vanishing. More significantly, all 3 families reported that their children had been talking about the nice lady in the days leading up to their disappearances. When Dr. Wilson interviewed surviving siblings and cousins, they described a woman who watched them from the edge of the cornfields, waving and smiling, but never speaking loud enough to be heard by adults. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across multiple witnesses. A middle-aged woman with graying hair, wearing clothes that seemed old-fashioned, standing just inside the corn rows where she could be seen by children, but remain hidden from adult observers. Several children reported that the woman had gestured for them to come closer, promising games and treats if they would visit her in the corn maze. She said she had toys, reported 8-year-old Jessica Santos, Maria's older sister. She said she had dolls and candy, and that she wanted to play with us because she got lonely in the corn. She said grown-ups couldn't come because they were too big and would break the corn, but children were just the right size. Sheriff Reeves organized a systematic surveillance operation, positioning deputies with binoculars at strategic points around every major cornfield in the county. The surveillance teams worked in shifts, maintaining constant observation during the afternoon hours when the previous disappearances had occurred. They were looking for any adult who might be using the cornfields to approach children. Any unusual activity that might explain how 3 children had vanished without leaving physical evidence. For 3 days, they observed nothing unusual. The cornfields remained empty except for the occasional deer or wild turkey, and no adults were seen entering or leaving the agricultural areas during the critical afternoon hours. Sheriff Reeves began to wonder if they were dealing with someone who had been spooked by the increased law enforcement presence and had ceased their activities, at least temporarily. Then, on a Thursday afternoon when the shadows were growing long and the temperature was dropping from its midday high, Deputy Martinez reported movement in the Brewster field, the same 40-acre corn maze where Lucy Morrison had vanished 3 weeks earlier. "There's someone in there," Martinez whispered into his radio, his voice tight with tension. "Adult female, moving through the rows about 50 yards from the tree line. She's waving at something. There's nobody else visible, but she's definitely waving and smiling like she's trying to get someone's attention." Sheriff Reeves and 2 other deputies converged on the location, entering the corn maze from different points to prevent the suspect from escaping through the maze's multiple exits. What they found deep in the golden labyrinth would haunt them for the rest of their careers, and forever change how they viewed the relationship between childhood innocence and adult evil. The woman stood in a small clearing that had been carefully created by bending corn stalks into a perfect circle about 20 feet in diameter. The stalks hadn't been cut or broken, but had been carefully bent over and woven together to create a natural room, hidden in the heart of the maze. The clearing was decorated with children's toys, colorful blankets, and what appeared to be a tea set arranged on a small table made from a tree stump. She was in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a style that seemed more appropriate for the 1950s than the 21st century. Her clothes were likewise outdated. A floral dress that reached below her knees, practical shoes, and a cardigan sweater despite the warm October weather. But it was her eyes that stopped Sheriff Reeves cold. They held the vacant, unfocused stare of someone who wasn't entirely present in reality. "Ma'am," Sheriff Reeves called out, his hand resting on his service weapon while trying to maintain a non-threatening posture. "I need you to step out of the field with your hands visible. We need to talk to you about some missing children." The woman turned toward him with a smile that was both gentle and terrifying, the kind of expression that might have been reassuring on the face of a kindergarten teacher but seemed deeply wrong in the context of a hidden clearing where children had been lured to their deaths. "They come when I call," she said, in a voice so soft it was barely audible above the rustling corn. Her tone was conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than confessing to child abduction. "The children always come. They understand that I'm trying to help them, trying to save them from all the terrible things that happen when you grow up." "Help them how?" Sheriff Reeves asked, motioning for his deputies to circle around behind her, while keeping his own voice calm and non-confrontational. "Where are Lucy and Tommy and Maria? What happened to the children who came to visit you?" "Safe," the woman replied, her smile never wavering. "Safer than they've ever been. No more pain, no more fear, no more growing up to be disappointed by the world. I've given them the gift of staying young forever, of remaining innocent and happy, just like they were when they trusted me enough to come and play." The woman, identified as Rebecca Thornton after a search of missing persons databases, revealed that she had disappeared from a Dallas psychiatric facility 6 months earlier, had been an elementary school teacher in Lampasas County for over 15 years, until her dismissal 3 years earlier following a series of concerning incidents involving inappropriate attachment to students. Rebecca's employment records painted a picture of a woman whose behavior had become increasingly problematic over her final years in the classroom. Parents had complained that she showed favoritism towards certain students, insisting that these children were special and needed extra protection from the harsh realities of the world. She had been reprimanded for taking unauthorized photographs of students, for keeping them after school without parental permission, and for making inappropriate comments about their home lives. The final incident that led to her dismissal involved a confrontation with a parent who discovered that Rebecca had been giving her son gifts and telling him that his family didn't understand how special he was. When the parent demanded that Rebecca stop contacting their child, Rebecca had responded with a disturbing rant about how parents didn't deserve their children and how she could provide better care than biological families. Since her dismissal from teaching, Rebecca had been living in a small cabin on property inherited from her grandmother, land that bordered several of the county's largest farms and provided easy access to the cornfields that became her hunting grounds. The property was isolated, reached by a dirt road that saw little traffic, and surrounded by dense woods that would muffle any sounds from potential victims. When Sheriff Reeves and his team searched Thornton's property with a warrant obtained after her arrest, they discovered a nightmare hidden beneath the innocent facade of rural domesticity. The main cabin appeared normal from the outside, a small, well-maintained structure surrounded by flower gardens and bird feeders that suggested a lonely but harmless elderly woman living a quiet country life. But the basement of her cabin had been converted into what could only be described as a shrine to childhood, filled with toys, children's clothing, and hundreds of photographs of students she had taught over the years. The walls were covered with pictures arranged chronologically, showing the same children aging from kindergarten through 5th grade, with Rebecca's handwritten notes describing their personalities, their fears, their family situations, and their potential for what she called salvation. Most disturbing was a series of detailed journals in which Thornton had documented her surveillance of local families over the months leading up to the disappearances. She had been watching children for months, learning their routines, identifying which ones played alone in backyards that bordered cornfields, and developing elaborate plans for what she called rescue operations. Her entries revealed a twisted maternal obsession that had gradually escalated from watching to more direct intervention. She described hiding in cornfields during the day, observing children at play, and learning to mimic their mothers' voices to call them away from safety. The journals showed that she had practiced for weeks, perfecting the vocal techniques that would allow her to lure specific children into the corn mazes. They were being hurt, Thornton insisted during her interrogation, showing no awareness that her actions constituted crimes rather than acts of mercy. Parents don't understand how cruel the world is to children. They think love means preparing them for disappointment and pain, teaching them that the world is harsh and unfair. I was protecting them from growing up, from learning to be disappointed and bitter like all adults eventually become. The location of the missing children remained a mystery until cadaver dogs led investigators to a section of the Brewster farm that had been recently cultivated. The dogs, specially trained to detect human remains even when buried, alerted on an area about 100 yards from where Rebecca had created her hidden clearing in the corn maze. Beneath the freshly turned soil, investigators discovered the remains of Lucy Morrison, Tommy Rodriguez, and Maria Santos, as well as 2 other children whose disappearances in neighboring counties had never been connected to Lampasas County. The children had died from sedative overdoses, apparently administered through candy that Thornton had used to lure them deeper into the corn mazes before leading them to her hidden clearing. In her twisted logic, she had been preserving them at the perfect age, before life could corrupt their innocence with the disappointments and compromises that she believed inevitably came with adulthood. The journals revealed her belief that childhood was the only time when humans could experience pure happiness, and that allowing children to grow up was a form of cruelty that she was morally obligated to prevent. The investigation revealed that Thornton had been escalating her activities over several years, following a pattern that had become increasingly sophisticated and deadly. Initially, she had simply watched children from a distance, deriving satisfaction from observing their play while imagining herself as their protector. But her dismissal from teaching had severed her legitimate connection to children, leading to increasingly desperate attempts to maintain contact with them. After losing her job, she'd begun approaching children more directly, always in locations where she could retreat into cornfields if adults became suspicious. She had tested various methods of gaining their trust, eventually settling on a persona that combined maternal warmth with promises of special treatment and exclusive attention. The cornfields had provided the perfect hunting ground for someone with Thornton's psychological profile. Their maze-like structure offered concealment, while their seasonal growth cycle ensured that evidence would be naturally buried and disturbed by farming activities. Thornton had timed her activities to coincide with harvest preparation, knowing that the fields would be tilled and replanted, effectively erasing any trace of her crimes. She understood children's psychology better than most parents, explained Dr. Wilson during Thornton's psychological evaluation. Her years as a teacher had taught her exactly how to approach children in ways that would bypass their natural caution about strangers. She knew which words would make them feel special, which promises would overcome their fear of breaking rules, and how to create a sense of urgency that would make them act before thinking. For the families of the victims, the revelation brought a mixture of closure and devastating grief. The knowledge that their children had died believing they were being helped by a caring adult, rather than recognizing the danger they were in, added an extra layer of trauma to their loss. She stole their trust, Maria Santos's father, Carlos, said during Thornton's sentencing hearing, his voice breaking as he spoke directly to the woman who had killed his daughter. My Maria thought she was going to see a nice lady who wanted to play with her. She went willingly, happily, because she believed she was going to have fun. Instead, she was led to her death by someone who claimed to love children but understood nothing about what children actually need. The impact of the case on the rural community of Lampasas County was profound and lasting. Parents became hypervigilant about supervising outdoor play, installing security systems and establishing strict protocols for where their children could go and when. Many families moved away from properties that bordered large agricultural fields, unable to overcome their fear that corn mazes and crop fields had become hunting grounds for predators. The annual Corn Maze Festival, a beloved local tradition that had brought families together for over 20 years, was canceled permanently as the association with Thornton's crimes proved too traumatic for residents to overcome. The festival had been a major fundraiser for local schools and charities, and its loss created financial hardships that added to the community's sense of violation and loss. Sheriff Reeves implemented comprehensive new protocols for investigating reports of suspicious adults near school grounds or recreational areas where children gathered. His department established partnerships with neighboring counties to share information about potential child predators who might be operating across jurisdictional boundaries, recognizing that rural criminals often exploited the gaps between different law enforcement agencies. The psychological profile of Rebecca Thornton became a case study in criminal psychology programs across the country, used to train law enforcement officers, social workers, and educators about the warning signs of adults who pose dangers to children. Experts noted how her background as a teacher had provided both access to potential victims and a rationale for her actions that allowed her to avoid recognizing the criminal nature of her behavior. Thornton represents a particularly dangerous type of predator, explained Dr. Michael Chen, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case and later wrote extensively about the psychological factors that had contributed to her crimes. She genuinely believed she was helping her victims, which allowed her to maintain a facade of normalcy while escalating her criminal behavior. Her use of familiar agricultural landscapes as hunting grounds shows sophisticated understanding of how to exploit rural community dynamics. The case also highlighted the vulnerabilities that exist in rural communities where children traditionally enjoyed greater freedom to explore and play without constant adult supervision. The cornfields that had been part of the county's agricultural heritage for over a century suddenly seemed ominous and threatening, transformed from symbols of prosperity and tradition into reminders of how predators could exploit the very characteristics that made rural life appealing. The cornfields of Lampasas County eventually returned to their agricultural purpose, but local residents never quite viewed them the same way. What had once been symbols of agricultural abundance and seasonal change became reminders of how predators could hide among the most innocent aspects of rural life, using the very landscapes that defined community identity as weapons against the most vulnerable members of society. Years later, when new families moved to the area, longtime residents would quietly warn them about the importance of supervising children near the cornfields, though few would explain the full story behind their caution. The legend of the Whispering Fields became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk in the most familiar landscapes. Sheriff Reeves retired in 2024, but the Thornton case remained the most difficult of his career. In his final interview with the local newspaper, he reflected on how the case had changed his understanding of rural law enforcement and the unique challenges faced by communities where isolation could be both a blessing and a curse. "We think of the countryside as safe, especially for children," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Wide open spaces, close-knit communities, everyone looking out for everyone else. But that same openness can be exploited by someone with bad intentions. Thornton used our trust against us, used our children's natural curiosity and innocence as weapons to harm them." The memorial garden, planted in honor of the 5 children who died, includes a section dedicated to child safety education, where local schools bring students to learn about recognizing and avoiding dangerous adults. The garden borders the site where the Brewster cornfield once stood, now converted to a more open pasture where visibility is maintained year-round and children can play safely under adult supervision. The educational programs developed in response to the Thornton case have been adopted by rural communities across Texas and beyond, providing age-appropriate instruction about personal safety while preserving the kind of childhood freedom that makes rural life appealing to families. The programs emphasize the importance of trusting instincts, communicating with parents, and understanding that not all adults who seem friendly have good intentions. Today, the case files on Rebecca Thornton remain active as investigators continue to examine unsolved child disappearances across Texas and surrounding states, looking for patterns that might indicate other victims. The possibility that her crimes extended beyond Lampasas County haunts investigators who recognize that her methodical approach and former teacher's mobility could have facilitated a much larger victim count than was ever proven in court. The Whispering Fields of Lampasas County no longer whisper with the Whispering Fields of Lampasas County, no longer whisper with cornstalks in the wind, but their silence carries its own weight of memory. For those who lived through the terror of those October weeks in 2020, The sight of any corn maze or agricultural labyrinth serves as a reminder that predators don't always hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they hide in the golden afternoon light of a harvest field, using the very symbols of rural innocence to mask the darkest of intentions. The psychological trauma of the case extended beyond the immediate families to affect the entire community in ways that continued to manifest years after Thornton's conviction. Children who had been friends with the victims struggled with survivors' guilt, wondering why they hadn't been chosen and whether they could have somehow prevented their friends' deaths. Adults grappled with the knowledge that their community's greatest strength, the trust and openness that allowed children to play freely, had been weaponized against them. Local churches organized support groups and counseling sessions, but the healing process proved slow and incomplete. The Methodist Church, where the Morrison family had worshipped for 4 generations, lost several member families who couldn't bear to remain in a community where such horror had occurred. The Catholic Church, where the Rodriguez and Santos families attended Mass, implemented new policies requiring adult supervision for all children's activities, fundamentally changing the nature of religious education and youth programs. The economic impact of the case was also significant, though often overlooked in discussions focused on the human cost. Property values in areas bordering agricultural fields dropped by an average of 30%, as families specifically sought homes without cornfields in their vicinity. Several farming families who had grown corn for generations switched to other crops, unable to bear the association between their livelihood and the deaths of local children. The Brewster farm, where 3 of the 5 victims had been found, was eventually sold to developers who converted it into a residential subdivision. The new development, marketed to families from Austin seeking affordable rural living, made no mention of the property's tragic history, though state law required general disclosures about material facts that might affect property values. Dr. Wilson's psychological analysis of the case revealed disturbing insights about how predators like Thornton could operate undetected in small communities. Her report noted that Thornton had carefully cultivated a public persona as a caring, if somewhat eccentric, former teacher who had been unfairly treated by the school system. This narrative had generated sympathy among community members who viewed her as a victim of bureaucratic injustice, rather than recognizing the warning signs of dangerous obsession. Rural communities often protect their members from outside scrutiny, Dr. Wilson wrote in her final report. This protective instinct, while generally beneficial, can also shield predators who understand how to manipulate community sentiment. Thornton presented herself as someone who loved children too much, rather than someone who posed a danger to them, making it difficult for community members to recognize the threat she represented. The case also highlighted gaps in the mental health system that had allowed Thornton to disappear from professional oversight. Her discharge from the Dallas psychiatric facility had been processed as a routine release, with no notification to law enforcement agencies in areas where she might relocate. The cabin she inherited from her grandmother had provided a perfect refuge where she could live without neighbors or regular contact with social services. State legislators used the Thornton case to support legislation requiring better coordination between mental health facilities and law enforcement agencies, particularly in cases involving individuals with histories of concerning behavior toward children. The Lucy Morrison Act established protocols for monitoring and reporting when individuals with documented histories of child-related psychological disorders relocate to new communities. Sheriff Reeves's department worked with state officials to develop training programs for rural law enforcement agencies, focusing on the unique challenges of investigating crimes against children in agricultural communities. The programs emphasized the importance of taking seriously reports of adults who showed unusual interest in children, even when their behavior didn't immediately rise to the level of criminal activity. We learned that prevention is more effective than investigation when it comes to protecting children, Sheriff Reeves explained during a conference presentation about the case. By the time we're investigating, it's often too late. The key is recognizing warning signs early and taking action before crimes are committed. The training programs developed in response to the Thornton case included modules on understanding the psychology of child predators, recognizing manipulation tactics used to gain community trust, and implementing surveillance techniques appropriate for rural environments. The programs were eventually adopted by law enforcement agencies across the Southwest, becoming standard training for officers working in agricultural communities. The corn industry in Texas also responded to the case by developing safety guidelines for agricultural tourism activities, particularly corn mazes and similar attractions that brought children into environments where supervision could be difficult. The guidelines included requirements for adult supervision ratios, emergency communication systems, and background checks for employees working in child-oriented agricultural attractions. Local schools implemented comprehensive safety education programs that taught children how to recognize and respond to adults who might pose dangers. The programs were carefully designed to maintain children's natural openness and curiosity, while providing them with tools to protect themselves from manipulation. Role-playing exercises helped children practice saying no to adults who asked them to go somewhere without parental permission, even when those adults seemed friendly and trustworthy. The legacy of Rebecca Thornton's crimes extended beyond Lampasas County to influence child protection policies across rural America. Federal agencies began tracking patterns of child disappearances in agricultural areas more systematically, recognizing that cornfields, wheat fields, and other crop environments could provide concealment for predators while appearing innocuous to casual observation. The case became required reading in criminal justice programs studying rural crime patterns, used to illustrate how geographic isolation could be exploited by criminals while also making investigation and prevention more challenging. Thornton's use of agricultural landscapes as both hunting grounds and disposal sites represented a sophisticated understanding of how rural environments could be weaponized against vulnerable populations. Years after the case concluded, forensic psychologists continued to study Thornton's journals and recorded statements, seeking to understand the mental processes that had allowed her to justify her actions as acts of mercy rather than murder. Her ability to maintain this self-deception even after arrest suggested psychological mechanisms that could potentially be identified in other cases before they progressed to violence. The most disturbing aspect of Thornton's psychology wasn't her hatred of children, but her perverted love for them, explained Dr. Chen in a follow-up study published 5 years after her conviction. She genuinely believed she was saving them from suffering, which made her crimes feel justified in her own mind. This type of delusional thinking is particularly dangerous because it can persist even when confronted with evidence of the harm being caused. The community healing process in Lampasas County proved to be a long-term effort, requiring sustained support from mental health professionals, religious leaders, and state agencies. Annual memorial services for the victims became important rituals for processing grief and maintaining awareness of the need for continued vigilance. The services also served as reminders that healing was possible, even after experiencing such profound trauma. Local businesses eventually recovered from the economic impacts of the case, though it took several years for tourism and agricultural activities to return to previous levels. The county's reputation for safety and rural tranquility had been damaged, but community leaders worked to rebuild trust through transparency about safety measures and honest discussions about lessons learned from the tragedy. The Thornton case also influenced how rural communities approached the balance between maintaining traditional freedoms and implementing modern safety measures. Many families found ways to preserve the independence and outdoor exploration that characterized rural childhood, while adding layers of supervision and communication that provided protection without destroying the essential character of rural life. Today, children in Lampasas County still play outside, explore their environments, and enjoy the kind of freedom that draws families to rural communities. But they do so with greater awareness of potential dangers and better communication with adults who can protect them. The innocence of earlier generations has been tempered by hard-earned wisdom about the realities of human nature and the need for constant vigilance. The case files on Rebecca Thornton fill an entire drawer in the Lampasas County Sheriff's Department, serving as a reminder of how much damage one disturbed individual can inflict on a community. The files include not only evidence and testimony related to her crimes, but also documentation of the community's response and the long-term effects of her actions on local families and institutions. For those who knew her as a teacher, the revelation of a Thornton's crimes required a painful reassessment of interactions and observations that had seemed innocent at the time. Former colleagues struggled with guilt about warning signs they might have missed, while parents wondered whether their children had been exposed to danger during their school years without anyone recognizing the threat. The elementary school where Thornton had taught was eventually rebuilt and renamed, as the community decided that the physical structure itself had become too associated with her crimes to continue serving as an educational environment. The new school incorporated advanced security features and protocols that would have been unthinkable before the case, representing both progress in child protection and loss of the innocence that had once characterized rural education. The cornfields that had been the setting for Thornton's crimes were gradually replanted with other crops or converted to different uses, as farmers found that the association with the murders made it difficult to maintain corn production in those specific locations. The change in agricultural patterns served as a visible reminder of how criminal acts could alter not just human lives, but entire landscapes and economic systems. The whispering fields of Lampasas County now grow soybeans and cotton instead of corn, but the lessons learned from Rebecca Thornton's crimes continue to influence how rural communities protect their children while preserving the freedom and independence that make rural life appealing. The whispers have been replaced by more direct communication, the secrets transformed into shared awareness, and the hidden dangers brought into the light where they can be recognized and prevented. The heat rising from the asphalt created shimmering mirages that danced across State Highway 359 like phantoms seeking escape from the merciless South Texas sun. But Sheriff Rosa Martinez knew the disturbing pattern she'd been tracking. For 6 months was no illusion born of desert heat and desperate hope. 3 different stretches of the lonely 2-lane road through Jim Wells County had become dumping grounds for human remains, each location precisely placed to send a message that law enforcement was only beginning to understand, a message written in death, and positioned with the cold precision of someone who viewed murder as performance art. It had started in March 2021, with the discovery of Maria Elena Vasquez's body, found in a roadside ditch exactly 1 mile north of the county line where Highway 359 crossed from Duval County into Jim Wells. The 34-year-old mother of 2 had been missing for 8 days from her home in Corpus Christi, and the medical examiner determined she'd been dead for most of that time. What made the case unusual wasn't the cause of death, strangulation, sadly common in domestic violence cases, but the meticulous way her body had been positioned. Maria Elena lay with her arms crossed over her chest in the manner of funeral home preparation, her head pointing due north toward Alice, the county seat. Her clothing had been carefully arranged, her hair combed, and her hands folded as if she were lying in a coffin rather than a ditch beside a state highway. Most disturbing was the small hand-painted sign placed near her body, weatherproofed and professionally lettered, Mile 1, the journey begins. Sheriff Martinez had initially treated it as an isolated incident, possibly the work of someone with a personal connection to the victim who felt compelled to treat her remains with dignity despite the circumstances of her death. The positioning suggested someone familiar with funeral customs, possibly an undertaker or mortician who had been involved in Maria Elena's murder, but retained enough respect for the dead to arrange her body properly. But when a second body appeared 2 months later, positioned identically but with a sign reading, "Mile 2, understanding grows," Sheriff Martinez realized they were dealing with something far more systematic and disturbing than a single crime of passion. The second victim was Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old nurse from San Antonio, whose disappearance hadn't even been reported yet when hikers found her body in another roadside location exactly 2 miles further north on Highway 359. Like Maria Elena, Jennifer had been strangled and carefully arranged with religious precision. Unlike typical dump sites chosen for concealment, both locations were highly visible to passing traffic, as if the killer wanted the bodies to be discovered quickly and the messages to be seen. The positioning was identical in every detail. Arms crossed, head pointing north, clothing arranged to preserve modesty, hair combed and hands folded. The signs were painted in the same style with the same type of weather-resistant paint, suggesting they had been prepared in advance as part of a larger plan. By the time the third victim appeared in July, 31-year-old teacher Amanda Chen from Houston, found at the 3-mile marker with a sign reading, "Mile 3, the path reveals itself," Sheriff Martinez understood she was dealing with a serial killer who was using Highway 359 as both hunting ground and gallery for his crimes. The pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. Women in their 20s and 30s, abducted from various Texas cities, murdered elsewhere, and transported to Jim Wells County for display. Each victim was placed exactly 1 mile apart, creating what investigators came to call the Bone Road, a macabre installation that stretched north from the county line toward Alice like stations of the cross marking a twisted pilgrimage route. Federal agents arrived to assist with the investigation, bringing resources and expertise that Sheriff Martinez's small department couldn't match. FBI profiler Dr. Amanda Torres reviewed the crime scenes and victim profiles, developing a disturbing theory about the killer's methodology and psychological motivations. "He's not just disposing of bodies," Dr. Torres explained during a briefing with local law enforcement at the Jim Wells County Courthouse. "He's creating a narrative, telling a story that builds with each victim. The signs suggest he sees himself as a teacher or guide, leading viewers along a path of understanding. This type of killer views his crimes as educational experiences, both for himself and for anyone who discovers his work." The killer's sophistication became apparent as the investigation progressed and federal resources were brought to bear on the case. Each victim had been abducted using different methods. Maria Elena from a grocery store parking lot in broad daylight, Jennifer from her apartment complex during her lunch break, Amanda from a restaurant where she was dining alone after attending a conference. The variety suggested someone comfortable operating across multiple cities and environments with the resources and knowledge to avoid detection while transporting victims across hundreds of miles. More troubling was the realization that the killer had detailed knowledge of Highway 359's traffic patterns and law enforcement patrol schedules. Each body had been placed during narrow windows when the road was likely to be empty of both civilian traffic and police presence, yet positioned to be discovered within days rather than weeks. The timing required careful observation and planning that spoke to extensive surveillance of the area. Sheriff Martinez spent countless hours driving Highway 359 at different times of day and night, trying to understand how someone could place bodies along the roadside without being observed. The highway was used primarily by local residents traveling between small towns, long-haul truckers taking a scenic route to avoid interstate traffic, and occasional tourists heading to or from the coast. Traffic was light enough that any stopped vehicle would be visible to other drivers, yet somehow the killer had managed to position 3 bodies without being seen. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a routine audit of the State Highway Department's maintenance records. Sheriff Martinez discovered that all 3 dump sites corresponded to locations where recent roadwork had been completed, and each site had been visited by the same maintenance contractor in the weeks before the bodies were discovered. Highway maintenance worker Carl Brewster had been employed by the state for 12 years, a job that gave him intimate knowledge of rural road networks throughout South Texas. His work schedule showed regular overnight shifts that would have provided perfect cover for transporting and positioning bodies without observation. More significantly, his maintenance duties required him to travel the same routes repeatedly, allowing him to identify optimal locations for body disposal while appearing to conduct legitimate business. Brewster's employment records painted a picture of a reliable, if unremarkable, state employee who had never shown signs of violent behavior or criminal tendencies. His supervisors described him as quiet but competent, someone who preferred working alone and took pride in keeping the highways clean and safe for travelers. The irony that he had been using his position to turn highways into crime scenes wasn't lost on investigators. When Sheriff Martinez and federal agents executed a search warrant at Brewster's isolated trailer home outside Alice, they discovered the disturbing scope of his operation and the twisted ideology that had motivated his crimes. Maps of Highway 359 covered his walls, marked with detailed notations about traffic patterns, patrol schedules, and optimal placement locations. A workshop area contained tools for creating the small painted signs found with each victim, along with templates for additional signs that suggested plans for future murders. But the most chilling discovery was Brewster's detailed planning for what he called his educational series. Computer files revealed he had researched and selected over 20 potential victims across Texas, with detailed surveillance notes on their daily routines and vulnerabilities. His goal was to create a 10-mile installation of positioned bodies, each with increasingly cryptic messages designed to guide viewers toward what he called understanding the truth about women's role in society. The computer files contained hundreds of photographs taken during Brewster's surveillance activities: women leaving work, shopping alone, eating in restaurants, walking to their cars in parking lots. The photos were organized by city and included detailed notes about each potential victim's appearance, apparent social class, and perceived vulnerability. Some files went back years, suggesting that Brewster had been planning his murder spree for much longer than the 6 months during which bodies had been discovered. Brewster's journals revealed a twisted worldview that combined misogynistic ideology with grandiose delusions about his role as a teacher of social truth. He viewed his murders not as crimes, but as object lessons, using female victims to illustrate his beliefs about gender roles and social hierarchy. The positioning of bodies along Highway 359 was intended to create a teaching tool that would demonstrate what he saw as natural law. They think they can live independently, he had written about Maria Elena Vasquez, but they always end up needing to be shown their proper place. The road teaches what life cannot. Each mile marker is a lesson in the natural order of things, and by the time someone travels the full distance, they will understand what I understand about the way the world really works. During interrogation, Brewster showed no remorse for his crimes, instead expressing frustration that law enforcement had interrupted his educational project before completion. He described in clinical detail how he had used his highway maintenance position to scout for ideal locations and timing, treating the murders as a logistical challenge rather than the destruction of human lives. "You don't understand what I was building," he told investigators with the condescending tone of a teacher addressing slow students. Each mile was a lesson. Each woman was chosen to represent a different type of female arrogance. The working mother who thought she could do it all. The professional woman who thought she didn't need a man's protection. The educated woman who thought her degree made her superior. By the 10th mile, anyone traveling the road would understand the natural order. The investigation revealed that Brewster had been escalating his activities for several years before the Highway 359 murders. Earlier, victims, found in other counties and attributed to different killers or left as unsolved cases, showed similar positioning and attention to geographic placement when investigators reviewed cold case files with Brewster's methods in mind. Federal agents ultimately connected Brewster to 9 murders across 4 counties, with evidence suggesting several more victims who had been buried rather than displayed. His method of operation had evolved over time, from simple disposal of bodies to the elaborate theatrical installations found on Highway 359. The evolution suggested growing confidence and an increasing desire for recognition of his work. The psychological profile developed by federal investigators painted a picture of a man whose isolation and perceived failures in relationships with women had gradually transformed into murderous rage directed at female independence and success. His job, maintaining highways, had provided both the opportunity to commit crimes and the metaphorical framework for his twisted educational project. Brewster saw himself as a curator of female behavior, explained Dr. Torres during a press conference following his arrest. He used his access to rural highways to create what he viewed as a museum of lessons about gender roles. The positioning of bodies was intended to be instructional, with each victim representing a different failure to understand what he saw as natural law. The case had a devastating impact on the families of identified victims, who struggled to understand why their loved ones had been chosen for such a horrific fate. The knowledge that the murders were motivated not by personal vendetta or random violence, but by ideological hatred added an extra dimension of trauma to their grief. He turned my daughter into a prop, Maria Elena's mother, Carmen Vasquez, said during Brewster's sentencing hearing, her voice breaking as she addressed the packed courtroom. She was a person with dreams and children who loved her, but he reduced her to a symbol in his sick fantasy. That's not justice. That's evil, using our highways like a personal museum of hate. The psychological impact on Jim Wells County residents was equally severe and long-lasting. Highway 359 had been a vital transportation artery connecting small communities to larger cities, used daily by residents commuting to work, traveling to medical appointments, or visiting family in other towns. But many locals began avoiding the route entirely after learning about Brewster's crimes, choosing longer alternate routes rather than drive past the locations where bodies had been displayed. Property values along the highway plummeted as residents associated the area with Brewster's crimes. Several businesses that depended on highway traffic, gas stations, restaurants, and motels, suffered significant losses as travelers chose alternate routes. The economic impact extended beyond immediate business losses to affect the entire county's reputation and tourism industry. Sheriff Martinez worked with state officials to increase patrol frequency along Highway 359 and install additional emergency call boxes, but the road's reputation as the Bone Road proved difficult to overcome. Local civic organizations launched campaigns to rebrand the highway and emphasize its positive aspects, but the association with serial murder had become permanently embedded in public consciousness. The case prompted a comprehensive review of highway maintenance worker screening procedures across Texas. New protocols required background checks every 2 years, mandatory psychological evaluations for employees with access to remote work sites during overnight hours, and GPS tracking of all maintenance vehicles to ensure accountability for their locations and activities. State legislators used the Brewster case to support legislation requiring more extensive background investigations for state employees who worked alone in remote locations. The Highway Safety Act established new standards for monitoring and supervising workers whose jobs provided opportunities for criminal activity while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business. Brewster was ultimately convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. During his final appeal, he attempted to justify his crimes by claiming he had been conducting sociological research that would benefit society by revealing fundamental truths about gender dynamics and social organization. The appeals court rejected this argument, with Judge Patricia Williams writing in her opinion, "The defendant's attempt to intellectualize his crimes as social commentary cannot disguise the fundamental nature of his actions. The systematic murder of innocent women chosen solely for his personal gratification and ideological hatred. His use of public highways as display areas for his victims represents a particularly egregious violation of public trust and safety." Today, Highway 359 carries normal traffic once again, though memorial markers at the 3 primary crime scenes serve as reminders of the lives lost to Brewster's twisted worldview. The signs he placed with each victim were destroyed as evidence, but their messages remain preserved in case files that continue to be studied by criminal psychologists and law enforcement agencies seeking to understand and prevent similar crimes. Sheriff Martinez continued serving Jim Wells County until her retirement in 2023. But the Brewster case fundamentally changed her approach to rural law enforcement and her understanding of how seemingly ordinary residents could harbor extraordinary evil. She established new protocols for monitoring suspicious activity along remote highways and created partnerships with neighboring counties to share information about unusual crime patterns that might indicate serial offending. What made Brewster so dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, she explained during her farewell address to the department and community members who had supported her through the investigation. It was his ability to use the infrastructure we all depend on, our roads, our work schedules, our trust in familiar systems, as weapons against us. He turned our highway into his personal exhibition space, and we never saw it coming until it was too late to save his victims. The case became a standard example in FBI training programs for profiling serial killers who incorporate geographic or logistical themes into their crimes. Brewster's use of highway placement to create narrative meaning represents a particularly sophisticated form of criminal psychology that requires careful analysis to detect and prevent before it progresses to multiple murders. For the communities along Highway 359, the memories of the Bone Road gradually faded as new traffic patterns established themselves and life returned to normal rhythms. But local law enforcement agencies maintained heightened awareness of unusual activity along remote highways, understanding that the infrastructure designed to connect communities could also provide opportunities for those seeking to exploit isolation and anonymity. The detailed maps from Brewster's trailer, showing his planned expansion of the Bone Road installation to encompass 10 miles of Highway 359, remain classified evidence. Investigators continue to examine these documents for clues about potential victims who were never found, knowing that somewhere in the vast network of rural Texas highways, other crime scenes may still be waiting to be discovered. The case files on Carl Brewster fill an entire cabinet in the Jim Wells County Sheriff's Department, a testament to the complexity of investigating crimes that span multiple jurisdictions and years of planning. Among the documents are photographs of Highway 359 before and after the crimes, showing how a simple stretch of asphalt became forever changed by one man's desire to transform public space into a gallery for his twisted beliefs about women and society. For travelers passing through Jim Wells County today, Highway 359 appears unremarkable, just another rural road connecting small Texas towns across endless miles of mesquite and prickly pear. But for those who know its history, the road serves as a reminder that predators can find ways to weaponize even the most basic infrastructure, turning the pathways that connect communities into stages for their darkest impulses and most hateful ideologies. The memorial services held annually for Brewster's victims have become important community events that serve multiple purposes: honoring the memory of the women who died, supporting their families in their ongoing grief, and reminding residents of the need for continued vigilance against those who would exploit their rural isolation for criminal purposes. The Bone Road of Jim Wells County no longer displays the evidence of Carl Brewster's crimes, but the lessons learned from his systematic abuse of public trust continue to influence how rural law enforcement agencies approach highway safety, employee screening, and the investigation of crimes that use geographic features as elements of criminal methodology. The road itself has been reclaimed by legitimate travelers, but the memory of what it briefly became serves as a permanent reminder of the price of assuming that familiar faces and trusted institutions are always what they appear to be. The first thing Sheriff Tom Bradford noticed when he pulled into the parking lot of Hopkins County General Hospital was the complete absence of sound. No ambulance sirens cutting through the oppressive August heat. No emergency radio chatter crackling from the communications center. No voices from the staff smoking area behind the building where night shift workers typically gathered during their breaks. Just an unnatural silence that made his skin crawl, despite the 98-degree humidity that had gripped northeast Texas for weeks, creating an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. It was 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday when the call came in, a welfare check requested by the hospital administrator who claimed she hadn't been able to reach any of her night shift staff for over 2 hours. Dr. Patricia Morgan had been trying to contact the hospital from her home in Marshall after receiving automated alerts from the facility's computer systems indicating that several critical monitoring stations had gone offline simultaneously. In a rural hospital that served as the only emergency medical facility for 3 counties, communication blackouts didn't happen without serious cause. Hopkins County General was the lifeline for a scattered population of ranchers, small-town residents, and the occasional highway accident victim who needed immediate care before being transferred to larger facilities in Tyler or Shreveport. The hospital operated on skeleton crews during overnight hours, but those crews were trained to maintain constant communication with supervisors and emergency services. Sheriff Bradford had served Hopkins County for 19 years, responding to every kind of crisis the rural medical center could generate: overdoses from the growing opioid epidemic, farming accidents involving heavy machinery, domestic violence calls that spilled into the emergency room, and the occasional death that required law enforcement presence. But he'd never responded to a hospital where nobody answered the phones or replied to radio calls. The drive from his home outside Sulphur Springs normally took 25 minutes, but Bradford had made it in 18, pushing his patrol car through the empty rural roads with growing concern about what he might find. Hopkins County General Hospital had been the cornerstone of the community's medical infrastructure for over 40 years, and the idea that something might have happened to compromise its operation sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with his air conditioning. The automatic doors slid open as he approached the main entrance, revealing a reception area bathed in the sterile, fluorescent lighting that hospitals never turned off. But the reception desk was empty, computer terminals still glowing with half-completed patient records. A coffee cup sat beside a keyboard, still warm to the touch, and a half-eaten sandwich lay on a paper plate, as if someone had been interrupted mid-meal. "Hopkins County Sheriff's Department," Bradford called out. his voice echoing through empty corridors that should have shown signs of life even during the quietest overnight shifts. "Anyone here need assistance?" The silence that answered him was complete and wrong, in a way that made his hand instinctively move toward his service weapon. Even the quietest nights in a hospital carried background noise, the hum of machinery, the beeping of monitors, the distant sounds of staff making rounds and checking on patients. This silence felt absolute, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Bradford began a systematic search of the facility, starting with the emergency department where any crisis would likely have originated. The waiting room showed signs of recent activity, magazines scattered on tables, a child's toy left on a chair, vending machine lights still blinking, but no people. Behind the reception desk, he found something that stopped him cold and confirmed his worst fears about the situation. The emergency department logbook lay open to the current date, with entries continuing until 1:23 a.m. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting that contrasted sharply with the professional notes above it, read, "They're here. God help us all. Karen." Bradford keyed his radio to call for backup, but received only static in response despite being in an area with normally excellent coverage. His cell phone showed no signal, despite being in a location where he'd never had connectivity problems before. The hospital's landline phones were dead, their displays dark, and even the internet connection appeared to be down. Whatever had happened here had included systematic communication disruption. Moving deeper into the facility, Bradford discovered more signs of interrupted activity that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the night's events. In the cafeteria, a partially prepared meal sat on a prep counter, with ingredients laid out as if someone had been called away mid-task. The walk-in cooler door stood ajar, its alarm beeping steadily in the empty kitchen, the only sound in the entire building. The patient rooms told a more disturbing story. Beds that should have held overnight patients were empty but unmade, as if their occupants had left suddenly without time for proper discharge procedures. IV lines had been disconnected but not properly removed, leaving medical equipment scattered across bedside tables. In one room, Bradford found a wheelchair positioned facing the window, as if someone had been watching something outside before abandoning their post. The security office provided the first concrete evidence of what had occurred, though what Bradford saw on the monitors would challenge his understanding of how 15 people could simply vanish from a locked facility in the middle of the night. Video monitors showed various hospital corridors, all empty now, but the digital recorders were still functioning and had captured the night's events in terrifying detail. Bradford rewound the footage to 1:15 a.m. and watched events unfold that seemed to defy logical explanation. The recording showed normal hospital activity until exactly 1:18 a.m., when every person visible on camera, staff members, patients, even visitors who had been sleeping in waiting areas, simultaneously stopped what they were doing and walked purposefully toward the main exit. The footage was disturbing in its uniformity. Nurses abandoned critical patients mid-procedure. Security guards left their posts without a word, and even elderly patients with limited mobility managed to walk steadily toward the exit. They moved with mechanical precision, showing no signs of distress or coercion, as if responding to a signal only they could perceive. Their faces showed no emotion, no recognition of each other, just blank determination to reach the exit. Bradford watched in growing horror as a nurse disconnected an IV from a patient's arm without explanation. A security guard abandoned his post in the middle of making rounds, and even an elderly woman in a wheelchair somehow managed to stand and walk steadily toward the main entrance. Within 4 minutes, the hospital was completely empty, except for the electronic equipment that continued operating without human supervision. The exterior cameras captured the final moments of the mass exodus, showing 15 people gathered in the parking lot at exactly 1:22 a.m. They formed a perfect line facing north toward the dark woods that bordered the hospital property, standing motionless for approximately 3 minutes like soldiers awaiting orders. Then, without any visible signal or communication, they walked in unison into the tree line and disappeared from view. Sheriff Bradford immediately called for state assistance using his vehicle's more powerful radio system. But before backup could arrive, he made a discovery that transformed the case from missing persons to potential homicide with implications that extended far beyond Hopkins County. In the woods behind the hospital, following what appeared to be a well-worn path that showed signs of recent and repeated use, he found signs of recent excavation and evidence of long-term criminal activity. Freshly disturbed earth covered an area approximately 30 feet square, marked by small metal stakes arranged in a geometric pattern that suggested careful planning and measurement. The excavation site contained no human remains, but soil samples would later reveal traces of industrial chemicals commonly used in body decomposition and evidence of multiple burial and reinterment cycles. More disturbing were the personal items buried just beneath the surface: hospital ID badges, jewelry, clothing, and personal effects that appeared to belong to the missing staff and patients, but also items that seemed much older and weathered, suggesting that the night's events were part of a pattern that had been ongoing for much longer than anyone had suspected. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal agencies arrived to process the scene and coordinate the search for 15 missing persons. What they discovered beneath the hospital itself would become one of the most complex criminal cases in Texas history, revealing a sophisticated operation that had been using the trusted medical facility as cover for crimes that defied comprehension. Hidden basement levels, not shown on any architectural plans or building permits, had been constructed beneath the hospital during its renovation 5 years earlier. These underground chambers contained sophisticated medical equipment, but not for healing. The facility had been converted into a human trafficking operation, specializing in organ harvesting, with the legitimate hospital serving as cover for identifying suitable victims and providing medical infrastructure for criminal procedures. Dr. Michael Harrison, the hospital's chief of surgery and a respected member of the Hopkins County medical community for over 15 years, had been using his position to evaluate patients and select those whose disappearances would attract minimal attention: elderly patients with limited family contact, uninsured individuals seeking emergency care, psychiatric patients whose credibility would be questioned, and homeless individuals who had no one to report them missing. The mass exodus captured on security footage had been triggered by an emergency protocol Harrison had implemented when he learned of an impending state health department inspection that had been scheduled without his knowledge. Rather than risk exposure of his operation, he had activated a system that used subsonic frequencies broadcast through the hospital's intercom system to induce a hypnotic state in everyone present. Harrison had spent years developing the frequency manipulation technique, combining his medical knowledge of brainwave patterns with audio engineering expertise gained through correspondence with researchers studying mass hypnosis and crowd control. The affected individuals had been programmed through repeated exposure during previous hospital visits to respond to specific sound frequencies by entering a compliant state and following predetermined instructions. "It's a form of mass hypnosis," explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a neurologist from UT Southwestern brought in to consult on the case. Harrison used the hospital's own PA system to broadcast frequencies that triggered a conditioned response in people who had been gradually prepared for this exact scenario through previous exposure during medical visits. The underground facility revealed the scope of Harrison's operation and the sophistication of his criminal network. Surgical suites equipped for organ extraction, refrigeration units for storage, and shipping containers for transport indicated a network that extended far beyond Hopkins County. Financial records recovered from hidden computers showed millions of dollars in payments from international buyers willing to pay premium prices for organs from healthy donors, with Harrison's medical credentials providing legitimacy to what was essentially murder for profit. But the most disturbing discovery was Harrison's patient database, which contained detailed medical records for over 300 individuals who had visited the hospital during the past 5 years. Each record included annotations rating the viability of various organs, assessments of how much investigation their disappearance might generate, and detailed notes about their psychological susceptibility to hypnotic suggestion. The 15 people who had vanished during the night shift were found 3 days later in various locations across East Texas, all alive but with no memory of how they had arrived at their destinations. Medical examinations revealed that each had undergone minor surgical procedures while unconscious, with small incisions that could have been used to harvest tissue samples or implant tracking devices for future targeting. Dr. Harrison himself was never found. Evidence suggested he had fled the country using false documentation prepared years in advance, possibly to South America, where several similar organ trafficking networks had been identified by international law enforcement agencies. His associates in the operation had scattered as well, leaving behind only the physical evidence of their crimes. The psychological impact on the survivors was severe and lasting. None retained clear memories of their experience, but all reported recurring nightmares about being unable to control their own actions. Several required long-term psychiatric care to deal with the trauma of learning they had been systematically victimized over years of hospital visits without their knowledge or consent. For the Hopkins County community, the revelation that their trusted medical facility had been compromised was devastating beyond measure. The hospital was closed permanently, leaving residents without local emergency care and forcing them to travel over an hour to reach the nearest medical facility. Several families moved away entirely, unable to cope with the knowledge of what had been happening beneath their feet while they sought healing and comfort. Sheriff Bradford continued his investigation for 2 more years, working with federal agencies to identify other potential victims and track down Harrison's associates. The case ultimately led to the discovery of similar operations in 4 other states, dismantling using our faith in the healing profession to identify and exploit the most vulnerable members of our community. The empty hospital building still stands on the outskirts of town, its windows boarded and parking lot overgrown with weeds. Local officials have discussed demolishing the structure, but legal complications related to the ongoing federal investigation have prevented its removal. It serves as a grim reminder of how thoroughly evil can embed itself in institutions designed to preserve life. Today, Hopkins County residents travel to neighboring counties for medical care, an inconvenience that occasionally proves life-threatening when emergency transport times exceed critical windows. The community has never fully recovered from the loss of their hospital, or the knowledge of how it had been used to harm the very people it was supposed to protect. The case files on Dr. Michael Harrison and his organ trafficking network continue to grow, as investigators identify additional victims and pursue international connections. Interpol maintains active warrants for Harrison's arrest, but most law enforcement officials believe he has established a new identity in a country without extradition treaties. For Sheriff Bradford, who retired shortly after the case concluded, the Hopkins County Hospital investigation represented both the most important and most disturbing work of his career. "We always knew there were monsters in the world," he reflected during his retirement interview. "What we didn't expect was to find one hiding behind a stethoscope, using our own medical needs against us." The subsonic frequency equipment used in Harrison's mass hypnosis technique was studied extensively by federal researchers, leading to new regulations for hospital audio systems and protocols for detecting unusual broadcast frequencies in medical facilities. The technology represented a sophisticated understanding of both medical and psychological manipulation, that authorities fear could be replicated by other criminal organizations. Memorial services for the indirect victims of Harrison's operation, patients who died due to delayed or inadequate medical care following the hospital's closure, are held annually in Hopkins County. The community continues to lobby state officials for resources to rebuild their medical infrastructure, but progress has been slow due to the stigma associated with the Harrison case. The night shift at Hopkins County General Hospital ended not with the completion of medical duties, but with the revelation that healing and harm could coexist in the same institution, administered by the same hands that families had trusted with their most precious gift, their lives. For the survivors and the community that supported them, the knowledge that monsters can wear scrubs and operate with medical precision remains a wound that continues to heal slowly, one day at a time. The lessons learned from Dr. Harrison's crimes have influenced medical facility security protocols nationwide, but the deeper question of how communities can protect themselves from those who abuse positions of ultimate trust remains unanswered. In rural areas where medical professionals are revered as heroes and saviors, the idea that they might also be predators represents a fundamental challenge to the social trust that holds small communities together. Years later, when former patients of Hopkins County General Hospital seek medical care elsewhere, they often mention the difficulty of trusting new doctors after learning how their faith had been exploited. The psychological scars of Harrison's crimes extend far beyond his direct victims to encompass an entire community's relationship with the medical profession, creating a legacy of suspicion and fear that may take generations to overcome. The case remains a cautionary tale for rural law enforcement agencies about the unique challenges of investigating crimes that exploit community trust and institutional authority. When the monsters hide behind the very symbols of healing and help, detecting their crimes requires a level of skepticism that can feel like betrayal of the values that make rural communities strong. But for the families who lost loved ones to Harrison's operation, and for the survivors who must live with the knowledge of what was done to them, the most important lesson is simpler, that healing begins with truth. Justice requires persistence, and that even in the darkest moments, communities can find the strength to protect their most vulnerable members and rebuild what evil has destroyed. The night shift is over, but the memory of what happened during those dark hours continues to shape how Hopkins County approaches the delicate balance between trust and vigilance, between the faith that communities need to survive and the skepticism required to protect themselves from those who would exploit that faith for the most unforgivable purposes.